All right, so it's March 25th, 2026. We're 26 days into the war in the Middle East. And wow, a single statement is threatening to basically upend the entire global economic order. Today, we're going to break down exactly how that's happening. Okay, so this right here, this is the statement that sent shockwaves through global finance. You have to remember, for decades, literally decades, oil has been bought and sold in US dollars. That's the Petro-Dollar system. So when Iran says they'll only let tankers through if their oil is being sold in Chinese yuan, well, that's not just a threat. That is a direct attack on the entire system.
And you've got to understand, this move, it's not just a simple military blockade. We're talking about a very calculated economic attack, and we're already seeing the consequences ripple out across the globe. Iran's strategy here isn't just offensive. Nope. They're using their most powerful weapon, and it's not a missile. It's their control over one of the most vital energy choke points on the planet.
And here's what that looks like in cold, hard numbers. With the Strait of Hormuz basically shut down, analysts are now saying we could see oil hit $180 a barrel by the end of next month. And some are even whispering about $200 a barrel. I mean, let's be clear, this isn't some theoretical risk anymore. This is an economic shockwave that's hitting us right now. Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. You're seeing this two-pronged attack on the U.S. economy. On one hand, as everyone's scrambling for oil, the cost for the U.S. to borrow money is just spiking. The 30-year Treasury yield is up over 4.7%. But, and this is the kicker, at the exact same time, the world is using the dollar less. International use has dropped about 6% just since this war started. And guess where that trade is going? A lot of it is shifting to the yuan. And just look at this number. This really puts into perspective the massive financial pressure the U.S. is under. The federal debt is now rocketing towards $40 trillion. And as if that's not enough, we're hearing the Pentagon is about to go to Congress and ask for another $200 billion just to fund this war. It's a perfect storm, really. Costs are exploding while the country's financial footing is getting shakier. So let's switch gears a bit and look at the battlefield, because what's happening militarily is the key to understanding why Iran can even pull off this economic strategy. You know, everyone predicted this would be a quick, decisive campaign, but that's just not what's happening. Instead, the US and Israel are finding themselves bogged down in a really tough stalemate. What we're seeing here is a textbook case of asymmetric warfare. On one side, you have the US and Israel with their high-tech, super expensive airstrikes and air defense systems. But Iran, they're not playing that game. They're avoiding a head-on fight. Instead, they shut down the strait, they're hitting energy hubs across the region, and they're just firing off huge numbers of pretty sophisticated missiles. They are hitting their enemies where it hurts most, their wallets and their supply lines. And this really boils down to a war of attrition, and the math is just brutal. I mean, think about it. A single U.S. Patriot interceptor missile costs, what, over $3 million? And you might use it to take down a drone that costs maybe 25,000 euros. It's just not sustainable. U.S. and Israeli inventories of these high-tech interceptors are getting used up way faster than they can be replaced. We're talking years to get new ones. But Iran, they can churn out their lower-cost weapons much, much faster. And make no mistake, Iran isn't just lobbing these things over the fence and hoping for the best. No, their daily barrages are consistently getting through. They're using newer, more advanced missiles like their Fatah series that can actually maneuver to evade air defenses. And they've had successful strikes on major strategic targets all over Israel. We're talking Tel Aviv, Haifa, and even getting alarmingly close to the Dimona nuclear facility. They are getting past some of the most sophisticated defense systems on Earth. So you've got this military stalemate. Logically, you'd think, okay, time for diplomacy, right? But that's not what's happening at all. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Both sides seem to be digging in their heels, preparing for what they see as an existential struggle. There's just no room for compromise right now, no easy off-ramp. And look, the signals from the Trump administration aren't helping. One day it's talk of a ceasefire, the next it's threats to completely wipe out Iran's power grid. It's confusing, to say the least. So what about the other side? What is Iran actually saying? What would it take for them to stop? Well, Iran has put their cards on the table, and they're not asking for small concessions. They're demanding everything. Complete closure of every single U.S. military base in the Middle East. Ironclad, unbreakable guarantees against any future attacks. A whole new internationally run system for the Strait of Hormuz. Oh, and reparations to the U.S. and Israel. These aren't just demands. They're seen as terms of surrender. They are complete non-starters. And then you look at the other side, and the rhetoric is just as hardline. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been crystal clear. He said, "We will not stop this until the Iranians know they're on the bottom and we're on the top." I mean, with that kind of language, where's the middle ground? There is none. So let's recap. The military path is a stalemate. The diplomatic path is a dead end. So what happens now? Well, the conflict is now forcing a massive global realignment. This stopped being just a regional war a while ago. This is now a crisis that is fundamentally changing the global economic map. And this economic pain, it's not just a problem for the West, not by a long shot. Just look at how deeply Asia relies on the Strait of Hormuz. Japan, they get almost 3/4 of their energy from there. For major powers like China and India, it's over 40%. When your energy lifeline is choked off like this, it forces you to rethink everything, your alliances, and most importantly, how and with what currency you do business. And here's something you really need to let sink in. A lot of analysts are stressing this point. Even if a magical ceasefire were declared tomorrow, the damage is already done. We're talking about physical destruction of refineries, pipelines, and gas facilities. That kind of stuff takes months, if not years, to fix. What that means is we are locked into a future of higher energy prices and economic instability no matter what happens next. Which leads us to this pretty staggering conclusion that more and more analysts are coming to. The financial order that has governed the world since the end of World War II, the system built entirely on the power of the US dollar, the Bretton Woods system, is dead. It just can't handle a shock of this magnitude. Its very foundation, the Petro-Dollar, is crumbling before our eyes. You know, this war didn't create these problems out of thin air. It's acted more like a massive accelerant, pouring gasoline on trends that were already simmering. But the result is the same. The era of cheap energy and the absolute dominance of the dollar, well, that era is over. This crisis has fundamentally and permanently changed the world, and it leaves all of us with a huge critical question. What comes next?
Right now, there are 4 United States military divisions rapidly moving toward the Middle East.
Yeah, which is massive.
Right. I mean, we are talking about tens of thousands of soldiers. We're talking armored vehicles, logistical support ships, all of it just converging on the Persian Gulf.
And the crazy thing is, they aren't heading there to fight a traditional war over territory.
No, exactly. They aren't deploying over religion or, even terrorism. If you look really closely at the mechanics of what's happening, those soldiers are heading into hostile territory to basically save the American dollar from a piece of paper that was signed in Beijing.
Right, and that is a reality that the political establishment in Washington is doing, well, everything in its power to obscure right now.
Well, absolutely.
I mean, we are witnessing the collision of military logistics and global high finance. And the debris from that collision is going to fundamentally alter the global hierarchy.
It really is. So welcome to today's Deep Dive. You're listening to this on the morning of Wednesday, March 25th, 2026.
Wow, day 26.
Yeah, today marks exactly the 26th day of the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran. And our mission for this discussion really is to just cut through the noise.
Because there's so much noise right now.
So much. We are going to map out the most likely scenarios for how this crisis evolves over the coming weeks. And more importantly, we're forecasting the global ripple effects.
Which are going to hit everyone.
Definitely. So the title of today's deep dive is Yuan for Oil, How the U.S.-Israeli War Against Iran Ended the Petro-Dollar Era.
It's a heavy topic.
It is. So whether you're listening to this on your morning commute or maybe you're sitting at your desk walking the dog, whatever you're doing, just prepare yourself. We are going to explore how a localized military conflict in the deserts of the Middle East has, well, metastasized into a direct existential threat to the U.S. dollar.
And to global energy supply chains, too.
Right, and ultimately to the underlying value of the money sitting in your bank account right now. But before we get into all of that, I need to make something very clear to you, the listener. The sources driving our analysis today contain some extremely diverse, highly politically charged viewpoints.
From all across the geopolitical spectrum, really.
Exactly. Left, right, center, international.
Yeah.
So we are not taking sides here. We are not endorsing any of the political viewpoints contained in these reports.
No, not at all.
Our sole mission today is to impartially unpack and convey the facts, the ideas, and the analyses presented in the original source material. We just want you to understand the actual mechanics of this crisis.
Right. We're just looking at the board and explaining the moves. And I think the overarching theme here is the unwinding of assumptions.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, for half a century, the Western world has operated on a very specific set of geopolitical and economic assumptions. Mostly that American military deterrence is absolute.
Right, the whole don't mess with the U.S. military concept.
Exactly. And the second assumption is that the dominance of the U.S. financial system is just unassailable. But over the last 26 days, both of those pillars have really started to buckle under the weight of asymmetric warfare.
Yeah, and strategic economic countermeasures from Iran and its allies. So to understand how those pillars are buckling, we really have to start with the immediate news cycle,
Right.
because it is incredibly disorienting right now.
Oh, it's a mess.
If you've looked at any major news outlet in the last 48 hours, you are being bombarded with completely contradictory narratives. Like one headline says peace talks are imminent,
Right.
and then the literal next headline says the region is bracing for complete annihilation. It's a smokescreen of epic proportions.
It's staggering. I mean, the disconnect between the political narrative coming from the briefing rooms and the physical reality unfolding on the ground in the Persian Gulf, it's just wild.
So what's actually going on there?
Well, we're seeing a classic deployment of narrative control. It's designed to manage domestic market psychology rather than actually reflect the tactical situation.
Okay, so let's lay out the facts on the ground as they stand this morning. The U.S. president recently issued this massive 48-hour ultimatum to Tehran.
Yeah, a very public, very aggressive ultimatum.
The demand was basically binary, right? Iran must reopen the Strait of Hormuz immediately with zero conditions, or the United States military will systematically obliterate Iranian power infrastructure.
Which is, I mean, the rhetoric was incredibly specific.
Yeah, the president openly discussed targeting their largest centralized power plants. The goal would be to plunge a nation of nearly 90 million people into total darkness.
And we have to be clear about what that means. A threat of total systemic destruction, legally and historically, enters right into the territory of unrestricted warfare.
Right, because taking out the power grid doesn't just turn off the lights.
Exactly. Destroying a civilian power grid means hospitals fail, water sanitation ceases, food supply chains collapse. It was the ultimate geopolitical sledgehammer to wave around.
But then, just hours before this apocalyptic 48-hour deadline was supposed to trigger, the administration just suddenly slammed on the brakes.
Yeah, total reversal.
The president postponed his own ultimatum by 5 days. And the justification provided to the press was, frankly, bizarre.
It was very strange.
He claimed that very good and constructive conversations were actively taking place. He even alluded to having a direct line with some top-secret Iranian official.
Right, someone supposedly so highly placed that he couldn't even reveal the name, claiming the individual would be assassinated by hardliners in Tehran if he did.
It sounds like a spy movie. And adding to the surreal nature of that press conference, the administration really pushed the narrative that Iran's military capacity has been, entirely degraded.
Yeah, the president essentially claimed that Iran has no navy, no air force, and no leaders left.
Just painting this picture of a broken nation begging for a diplomatic off-ramp.
Right. And, if you only consume Western domestic news, you might actually believe that.
Sure, because that's all that's playing on the cable networks. But when you look at the primary sources, the statements coming directly out of Tehran, you find yourself in a completely different universe.
Entirely different.
Iran's supreme leader has categorically and publicly rejected the concept of a ceasefire. He explicitly stated to his own domestic audience and the international community that there are absolutely no secret back-channel talks happening with Washington.
Right. And furthermore, the conditions Iran has laid out for an end to hostilities, they are not the desperate pleas of a defeated nation.
No, not at all. They are absolute maximalist demands.
They are the demands of a strategic actor who believes they hold the dominant hand right now.
Which is wild to think about. What exactly are they demanding?
Well, the Supreme Leader's stated conditions require a complete American military and economic withdrawal from the entire Persian Gulf region.
So basically demanding the eviction of the U.S. from West Asia.
Yes. And beyond that, Tehran is demanding the lifting of all international and unilateral sanctions within a 60-day window.
Oh.
And they're demanding full financial compensation for all infrastructure damages incurred during the first 3 weeks of the war.
Okay, I want to push back on the administration's narrative here. Because those aren't the demands you make when your military is reduced to smoking rubble.
Exactly.
Those are the demands you make when you have the enemy in a chokehold. So help us see through this smoke screen here. If the U.S. is claiming victory and imminent peace, while Iran is demanding total capitulation. What is actually happening during this mysterious 5-day pause?
Okay, to decipher the truth, you have to ignore the political rhetoric completely. You have to track the military logistics.
Follow the troops.
Right. The smokescreen theory, which is currently dominating the analysis of independent military trackers, is highly persuasive.
What are the trackers seeing?
While the administration is publicly touting peace talks to soothe global markets, the physical movement of military hardware tells a deeply, deeply concerning story. Analysts are tracking the deployment of 4 full U.S. military divisions. They're either currently en route or aggressively staging for theater entry right now.
And we're talking about elite units here. The 82nd Airborne, the 101st Airborne, plus thousands of combat-ready Marines.
Yeah. You do not mobilize 4 divisions, coordinate the military sea lift command, and requisition that level of strategic airlift capacity for a peace negotiation.
Right. That's an invasion force.
The math of military logistics is unforgiving. Moving heavy armor, establishing forward operating bases, coordinating the arrival of tens of thousands of troops, it requires incredibly precise timing.
So they're staging for a massive ground operation.
Likely. Perhaps an attempt to seize a highly strategic geographical asset, say, Karg Island, which handles the overwhelming majority of Iran's oil exports.
Wow. Okay.
An operation like that requires the staging of roll-on, roll-off ships, massive refueling logistics, and perfect air cover synchronization.
So if you're a military strategist, a 5-day pause doesn't look like a sudden breakthrough in diplomacy.
Not at all.
It looks like a timeout in a football game where you're just subbing in your entire defensive line before a massive blitz. It's the exact amount of time it takes to maneuver heavy armor from a staging base onto transport planes.
Or to get a carrier strike group into its final firing position.
Yeah.
And it serves a dual purpose, really.
How so?
By calling it a pause for peace talks, the administration is managing market psychology.
Ah. Because if the markets knew...
Exactly. If Wall Street and the global commodities markets actually believed that a massive land invasion of Iranian territory was literally 48 hours away, you would see a historic, preemptive market crash.
Right. The Dow Jones would just plummet. Oil futures would instantly break the financial models.
So the pause is a controlled descent. It's a delay tactic to get the military pieces into position without triggering a premature domestic economic panic.
But this brings up a massive, glaring question about the fundamental strategy of the last 26 days.
Yeah?
If the United States is suddenly scrambling to rush 4 divisions of ground troops, Marines, and paratroopers halfway across the globe almost a month into an air war, it suggests a profound failure.
It does.
I mean, it means the original strategy of relying on air supremacy and standoff munitions has completely collapsed. You don't send the infantry if the bombers are doing their job.
No, you don't. And that is the stark and terrifying reality of the battlefield right now. The vaunted defensive shield, the technological edge that the U.S. and Israel have relied upon for decades, has critically fractured.
Okay, let's transition into the mechanics of that failure because the numbers here are just staggering. We really need to move from the political smokescreens into the mathematics of depletion.
Right, the math tells the real story.
Because for well over a decade, the global public has been sold this narrative that the Israeli and American air defense networks, systems like the Iron Dome, David's Sling, the Arrow 3 interceptors, that they operate like an impenetrable science fiction force field.
Yeah, an absolute iron shield.
The expectation is absolute precision. A radar detects a threat. A computer calculates the trajectory, an interceptor launches, and the threat is just vaporized in the upper atmosphere. So how does the most advanced, heavily funded military technology in human history just fail?
It fails because of the brutal, unforgiving economics of asymmetric warfare.
Unpack that for me.
Well, the reports coming from military analysts and defense contractors indicate a catastrophic depletion of U.S. and Israeli interceptor stockpiles. To put this in perspective, during just one 36-hour period of intense Iranian barrages earlier in the conflict, the defense coalition fired an amount of interceptors equivalent to a year and a half of total global manufacturing production.
Wait. Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around that correctly.
Yeah.
18 months of highly specialized industrial manufacturing capacity was completely burned through in a day and a half of fighting.
Yes, 36 hours. The defense architecture is built on a tiered system. You have the Arrow 3, which is designed to intercept ballistic missiles outside the Earth's atmosphere. Then you have David's Sling for high-altitude, medium-range threats. And finally, you have the Iron Dome for lower, slower, short-range rockets.
Okay, so a layer for every threat.
Right. But the fatal flaw in this architecture isn't the technology itself, it's the accounting.
The cost.
Exactly. It costs roughly $3 million to manufacture and fire a single high-end interceptor. And because no system is perfect, standard military doctrine often dictates firing 2, sometimes 3 interceptors at a single incoming target to guarantee a kill.
Oh, wow. So you're spending $6 to $9 million just to stop one incoming target. And what are those $3 million interceptors actually shooting down?
Well, often they are engaging Iranian drones, like the Shahed series.
Which cost what?
Roughly $25,000 to manufacture.
$25,000
Yeah.
against a $3 million missile.
Yeah. Or they are targeting older liquid-fueled ballistic missiles that Iran just pulled from cold storage. Iranian military tacticians executed a brilliant, albeit ruthless, strategy.
What do they do?
They used the first 3 weeks of this conflict entirely as a learning curve and a depletion mechanism. They launched massive, synchronized swarms of cheap drones and legacy missiles.
Just flooding the zone.
Exactly. The sole purpose of these swarms was to force the U.S. and Israel to light up their active, electronically scanned array radars.
Revealing their positions.
Yes, revealing their blind spots and the locations of their batteries, and simultaneously forcing them to exhaust their multi-million-dollar interceptor stockpiles on essentially disposable decoys.
Okay, but I want to challenge this. We've been told for years that the software behind systems like the Iron Dome is incredibly sophisticated. It's supposedly designed to calculate the trajectory of an incoming threat, determine if it's going to hit an empty desert or a populated city, and actively ignore the cheap decoys that aren't a threat. How did Iran trick those advanced targeting algorithms?
By fundamentally altering the radar cross-sections and flight profiles of the decoys.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, if you design a $25,000 drone to emit the radar signature of a much larger, more lethal cruise missile, the targeting algorithm cannot risk ignoring it.
Ah, so the computer thinks it's a massive threat.
Right. And if the swarm is routed directly over critical infrastructure, even if the system suspects it's a cheap drone, it is forced to engage. The algorithm's primary programming is protection, not budget management.
That makes total sense. It can't afford to be wrong.
Exactly. Iran leveraged that programming logic against the defenders. They mathematically bankrupted the magazines, and once the interceptor stockpiles reached critically low levels, Iran shifted phases. That's when they introduced their advanced weaponry.
And this is where we start hearing about the hypersonics, the Fateh 2 and the Khorramshahr 4. Let's really get into the physics here, because the word hypersonic gets thrown around on cable news constantly.
All the time.
And I think most people just assume it means a missile that flies really, really fast.
All right.
Why does a hypersonic missile completely break a traditional defense system?
Speed is only half the equation, though it is a terrifying half. I mean, these missiles are achieving speeds up to Mach 18.
Which is, what, over 13,000 miles per hour?
Yes. But the true paradigm shift is maneuverability.
Okay, explain that.
Think about a traditional ballistic missile, like an outfielder catching a fly ball in baseball. As soon as the ball leaves the bat, an experienced outfielder can calculate the parabolic arc, run to the exact spot on the field where gravity will bring the ball down, and just wait for it.
Right, because physics dictates exactly where an unpowered object is going to fall.
Precisely. Traditional interceptors work the exact same way. They calculate the predictable ballistic arc of the incoming missile and fly to a point of intersection in the sky.
But a hypersonic missile doesn't do that.
No. A hypersonic glide vehicle, like the Fateh 2, operates entirely differently. It utilizes a scramjet engine or a specialized glide body that engages as it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere.
So it's still under power.
Yes, it doesn't follow a predictable parabolic arc. It actually steers. It glides, dips, and maneuvers laterally at Mach 18.
So going back to our baseball analogy, it's as if the fly ball suddenly sprouted wings and turned into a remote-controlled drone right before it reached the outfield.
Exactly. The outfielder's math becomes instantly useless. The interceptor arrives at the calculated point of impact, and the hypersonic missile simply isn't there anymore.
Because it actively dodged out of the way.
Right.
While moving at 13,000 miles an hour.
Right. Furthermore, at Mach 18, the friction of the missile moving through the atmosphere creates a sheath of superheated plasma around the vehicle.
Plasma.
Yes, and this plasma sheath actually absorbs and scatters radar waves, making the missile effectively invisible to tracking systems during crucial phases of its flight.
That is insane.
It gets worse. To compound the defensive nightmare, missiles like the Khorramshahr-4 are equipped with submunitions. They don't just strike as a single warhead. In the terminal phase, they open up and release multiple independent re-entry vehicles.
That is just a staggering technological leap. You have a missile wrapped in an invisible plasma shield, traveling 18 times the speed of sound, dodging interceptors, and then splitting into a shotgun blast of warheads right before impact.
And the results on the ground have been devastating, both strategically and psychologically.
What have they hit?
Well, Iranian hypersonics have successfully bypassed the degraded shield and scored direct hits on incredibly sensitive areas. We've seen verified reports of strikes around Dimona.
Which is the heavily fortified home of Israel's nuclear program.
Exactly. They've also struck military installations in Arad. The realization setting in across Western defense establishments is that the skies are no longer protected. The supposedly impenetrable dome has shattered.
And the U.S. is having to adapt to this on the fly, right?
Yes. The situation has deteriorated so rapidly that the U.S. military has effectively abandoned relying on exhausted land-based Patriot batteries in certain sectors. They are shifting the burden entirely to ship-based Aegis combat systems stationed off the coast.
Let's clarify that for the listener. What is the actual difference between the land-based Patriot and the sea-based Aegis, and why is that shift so significant?
So, a Patriot battery relies on a sector search radar, which means it looks at a specific slice of the sky. Aegis, which is mounted on Navy destroyers and cruisers, utilizes the SPY-1 radar system. This provides a 360-degree, massive volumetric search capability, and it's tied to much larger SM-3 and SM-6 interceptor missiles in vertical launch tubes.
But the ships have to be in the water near the coast.
Right. Shifting to Aegis means the land-based infrastructure has failed, and the U.S. is now risking its billion-dollar naval assets by bringing them closer to the shoreline to act as a floating shield.
The psychological toll of this failure on the civilian populations living under that broken shield must be profound. I mean, for an entire generation, the psychological contract with the state was based on technological invulnerability. You hear the siren, you see the puff of smoke in the sky, you go back to drinking your coffee.
Right.
Now, the sirens mean something is actually going to hit the ground.
It fundamentally rewrites the calculus of national survival. And from a strategic standpoint, it completely inverts the leverage in the conflict.
Because they can't defend the airspace.
Exactly. Because the U.S. and Israel can no longer guarantee the integrity of their airspace, their ability to dictate terms has just evaporated.
Which brings us to the core issue. And this is where this conflict transitions from a regional kinetic war into a massive global financial earthquake.
Yeah, this is the pivot point.
Because the military shield in the air has failed, the offensive leverage has shifted entirely into Iran's hands. And Iran has recognized that they don't need to defeat the U.S. military in a head-to-head conventional battle.
Yeah.
They just need to weaponize geography.
Right.
They are moving us out of the realm of pure military combat and forcing us into the arena of global economic warfare. Let's break down the situation in the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz is, without hyperbole, the single most critical choke point of the global economy.
Just geographically speaking, it's tiny.
It is. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are only 2 miles wide in either direction. And yet, roughly 20% of all global liquid energy consumption passes through that narrow stretch of water. It is the jugular vein of the industrialized world.
And as of right now, that jugular has been severed. The strait is effectively closed.
It is entirely closed to any vessel associated with the U.S., Israel, or their allied coalition. Iran has explicitly stated that these ships are considered hostile military targets.
But the mechanism of closure isn't just the threat of Iranian anti-ship missiles, right? It's the reaction of the global financial sector.
Exactly. The global maritime insurance syndicates, primarily institutions operating out of Lloyd's of London, have entirely reassessed the risk.
They pulled the plug.
The Joint War Committee has elevated the threat level to a point where insurance companies are simply refusing to underwrite policies for ships attempting to transit the strait.
So let's explain how that insurance mechanism actually stops a ship. If I own an oil tanker, why can't I just risk it and sail through anyway?
Because modern shipping operates on massive amounts of leveraged debt and liability. An ultra-large crude carrier, fully loaded, represents hundreds of millions of dollars in asset value and cargo.
Right.
To operate legally, you need hull insurance, cargo insurance, and protection and indemnity insurance for environmental disasters.
Like an oil spill.
Yes. In a war zone, insurers charge a war risk premium, which is calculated as a percentage of the ship's total value. Normally, that premium might be, say, 0.05%.
Barely noticeable.
Right. But in the current environment, insurers are either demanding 5% to 10% of the hull value per voyage,
Which is millions of dollars.
which completely wipes out any profit margin for the cargo. Or they are just flatly denying coverage altogether. And if you don't have insurance, you are in breach of contract with the bank financing your ship, and the port authorities simply won't let you dock.
So the physical threat of the missile triggers the financial mechanism of the insurance market, which halts the supply chain completely.
Exactly. It's an elegant, devastating block.
So the U.S. Treasury Department looks at this paralyzed supply chain and realizes they are staring down the barrel of a global energy crisis. Oil prices are threatening to go to the moon.
Yeah.
In response, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent attempts what looks like a massive economic jujitsu maneuver. He essentially lifts the U.S. sanctions on Iranian oil exports.
Which caught everyone by surprise.
Completely. The logic he pitched to the public was, we are going to let Iran pump their oil into the global market to flood the supply. This will naturally drive the global price of oil down, saving the Western consumer at the gas pump.
Right.
And since all global oil is traded in U.S. dollars, we maintain ultimate control. We'll let them sell the oil, track the dollar transactions through the banking system, and just freeze those funds later.
It was a strategy steeped in the profound arrogance of a bygone era.
Oh, absolutely.
The U.S. Treasury assumed that the architecture of the 20th century was immutable. They believe that because they control the fiat currency, and because the global commodity market is priced in that currency, they essentially hold a leash on the physical reality of the oil, regardless of who pumps it.
But then Iran counters. And this specific counter move is the moment that historians a century from now might point to as the exact fulcrum of the 21st century.
I agree completely.
The U.S. tries to play its ultimate financial trump card, and Iran just flips the table.
Iran instituted a sovereign toll. They publicly announced that the Strait of Hormuz is open for business, but with a structural caveat.
And what a caveat it is.
Any oil passing through the strait and any transit fees associated with navigating those waters must now be transacted entirely in Chinese yuan, the renminbi.
They explicitly banned the use of the U.S. dollar for these energy transactions.
Yes.
It is breathtaking in its audacity. The U.S. Treasury said, we'll let you sell oil, but we'll control the dollars. And Iran looked back and said, we aren't playing Monopoly with your brightly colored paper money anymore.
It is a devastatingly effective maneuver. To fully grasp why this demand for the yuan is a geopolitical earthquake, we really have to pull back and examine the underlying architecture of the petrodollar system.
Right.
Because this is not merely a debate about currency exchange rates. This is about the structural foundation of American imperial power.
Let's dive deep into that history, because I don't think most people realize how recent and frankly how artificial the petrodollar system actually is.
It really is.
Take us back to the 1970s. How did this system start, and why does this Yuan ultimatum threaten the core of the U.S. economy?
Well, prior to 1971, the U.S. dollar was tied to the gold standard through the Bretton Woods Agreement. Foreign nations could confidently hold dollars knowing they could literally exchange them for physical gold from the U.S. Treasury.
It was backed by something real.
Right. But as the U.S. accumulated massive debts fighting the Vietnam War and funding domestic programs, nations began demanding their gold. Facing a run on Fort Knox, President Richard Nixon abruptly took the U.S. off the gold standard in 1971.
The Nixon shock.
Exactly. Overnight, the U.S. dollar became a purely fiat currency, backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the U.S. government.
Which created a massive vulnerability.
I
mean, if the dollar isn't backed by gold, why would Japan or Germany or France want to hold it?
That was exactly the problem the Nixon administration faced. To ensure the world still had a mandatory reason to hold dollars, Nixon, heavily guided by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon, orchestrated a masterstroke of financial diplomacy.
What did they do?
They forged a historic, largely secret agreement with Saudi Arabia and the broader OPEC nations. The deal was elegantly simple. The U.S. would guarantee the military survival of the House of Saud and provide them with advanced weaponry.
In exchange for what?
In exchange, Saudi Arabia agreed to exclusively price and sell all of its oil exports in U.S. dollars, and they would convince the rest of OPEC to do the same.
So if you were a rapidly industrializing nation, say South Korea or India, and you needed to buy oil to run your factories and fuel your cars, you couldn't just pay Saudi Arabia in your own currency.
No.
You had to first convert your currency into U.S. dollars.
Which created an artificial, infinite, and mandatory global demand for the U.S. dollar. Every nation on Earth needed a massive stockpile of dollars just to keep their lights on.
That is brilliant.
It was. But the genius of the system went one step further. What did Saudi Arabia and the OPEC nations do with all these billions of U.S. dollars flooding into their coffers?
Because they couldn't spend it all domestically, right?
Right. Through the agreements negotiated by William Simon, they recycled those petrodollars by reinvesting them into United States Treasury bonds.
Wow. They took the dollars they earned from oil and loaned them right back to the U.S. government, funding American deficits.
Yes. This mechanism, the Petro-Dollar recycling system, is the sole reason the United States currently enjoys its exorbitant privilege. It is the only mathematical reason the U.S. government can carry a staggering national debt of $39 to $40 trillion without suffering from Weimar-style hyperinflation.
Because the rest of the world is essentially forced to absorb American debt and inflate the value of the dollar because they need the currency to participate in the global energy market.
Exactly.
And what Iran has just done with this Yuan ultimatum, it bypasses that entire 50-year-old architecture.
By demanding payment in Chinese yuan, Iran is driving a stake directly into the heart of U.S. global financial hegemony.
Right.
If Japan or India desperately needs oil from the Persian Gulf today, they no longer need dollars, they have to acquire yuan. Furthermore, this transaction completely bypasses the Western banking infrastructure.
Okay, let's explain that part, because we hear a lot about SWIFT in the news. What is SWIFT, and how does transacting in yuan allow Iran to bypass it?
Well, SWIFT, Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is fundamentally just a messaging system. It's like a highly secure WhatsApp for global banks, telling Bank A to debit an account and Bank B to credit one.
Okay.
But because the vast majority of those transactions are in dollars, they ultimately have to clear through correspondent banks in the United States, putting them under the jurisdiction of the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury. This allows the U.S. to freeze funds, sanction nations, and weaponize the dollar.
But if they use yuan?
If they use yuan, they utilize China's alternative system, CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system. CIPS clears and settles transactions directly in renminbi onshore in China.
So the messaging and the money movement happen entirely outside the view of the New York Fed.
And more importantly, outside the jurisdiction of the New York Fed. The U.S. Treasury has zero visibility into the transaction, zero ability to sanction the actors involved, and zero leverage to freeze the funds.
To understand the scale of that threat, if the petrodollar system fractures and the world no longer needs to hold massive reserves of U.S. dollars to buy energy, what happens to that $40 trillion national debt?
It unravels.
How fast does the floor drop out?
Very fast. If the artificial global demand for the dollar evaporates, those trillions of dollars currently held by foreign central banks are going to come flooding back to the United States.
They're just going to dump their U.S. Treasury bonds.
Exactly. And to attract any buyers for its debt, the U.S. government will be forced to skyrocket interest rates. You are looking at the inability of the government to fund its massive deficit spending, a severe contraction in domestic credit, and massive, unstoppable domestic inflation as the money supply surges internally.
It is the rapid, chaotic unwinding of an empire's economic engine.
Yes, it is.
And the most terrifying aspect of this crisis is that while the currency shift is a macroeconomic earthquake that will play out over years, there is a physical, violent destruction of energy infrastructure happening right now that is going to hit the listener's wallet directly by next week.
Real-time consequences.
Let's look at the collateral carnage.
Right. Because the U.S. and Israel initiated strikes against Iranian energy sites early in the conflict, Iran has adopted a rigid strategy of symmetrical retaliation.
Eye for an eye.
The logic is clear. If you destroy our ability to generate and export energy, we will systematically dismantle the energy infrastructure of your regional allies.
And the execution of that strategy has been devastating so far.
We have seen precision strikes utterly decimate Kuwaiti energy sites. But the most critical escalation was the targeting of Qatar.
What happened in Qatar?
Iran struck Qatar's massive offshore gas fields, specifically the South Pars, or North Dome field, which is actually a single massive geological formation shared by both Iran and Qatar beneath the Persian Gulf.
Okay.
By hitting the Qatari extraction and processing platforms, Iran knocked out a massive percentage of the world's liquefied natural gas, or LNG, production capacity in a single afternoon.
Let's ground this reality for the listener, because if someone is listening to this in London or New York or Sydney, it is very easy to compartmentalize this. You think a Middle East conflict stays over there in the desert, it's a tragedy on television.
Right, it feels far away.
But walk us through the causal chain. How does a burning gas platform in the Persian Gulf translate directly into the price of groceries in a local supermarket or the interest rate on a mortgage?
The translation is terrifyingly fast because our physical world is far more fragile and interconnected than we like to admit.
We think we live in the cloud.
We live under the illusion of a digital, service-based economy, but at its foundation, everything is still driven by hydrocarbons.
So, Qatar's LNG.
Qatar supplies roughly 20% of the entire world's LNG. And over the last few years, Europe made a massive geopolitical shift to cut itself off from cheap Russian pipeline gas due to the conflict in Ukraine.
Right.
To replace that energy, Europe became completely reliant on seaborne LNG, primarily imported via specialized tanker ships from the U.S. and Qatar.
So Europe essentially traded secure Russian pipelines for highly vulnerable Qatari ships.
Exactly. And now, with Qatar's production severely damaged and the Strait of Hormuz blocked by insurance premiums and Iranian missiles, that seaborne gas simply isn't arriving.
So what happens to the market?
Instantly, there is a desperate, panicked bidding war on the global spot market for whatever energy is left. Industrial analysts and commodities traders are actively modeling scenarios where crude oil rockets to $150, $165, or even $200 a barrel by the end of the month.
Wow. At $200 a barrel, the math for the average consumer breaks completely.
Oh, completely.
We'd be paying double, perhaps triple the current price at the gas pump. The cost to fuel a diesel truck delivering Amazon packages or stocking grocery store shelves doubles overnight.
But the commute and the delivery truck are just the surface level of the crisis. The deeper terror lies in agriculture.
Food.
Modern, high-yield agriculture, which is the only reason we can feed 8 billion people on this planet, depends entirely on synthetic fertilizer.
Right.
And synthetic fertilizer is manufactured using the Haber-Bosch process, which requires massive amounts of natural gas as its primary feedstock to produce ammonia. If natural gas supplies are destroyed, fertilizer production halts. If fertilizer prices spike, the cost of growing wheat, corn, and soy skyrockets globally.
So a burning gas platform off the coast of Qatar means a farmer in the American Midwest or the French countryside cannot afford the fertilizer needed for the spring planting season.
Precisely.
Which means the crop yields collapse and the loaf of bread in London or New York doubles or triples in price.
We are looking at the very real possibility of cascading food shortages within a single harvest cycle. The economic contagion will be brutal.
And it won't hit everyone equally.
No. In the global south, nations that rely heavily on importing both energy and food, you will see immediate, crushing sovereign debt defaults and likely widespread social unrest.
And in the West?
In Western nations, central banks will find themselves entirely trapped. If inflation is raging at 15% or 20% because of systemic energy and food shortages, central banks cannot lower interest rates to stimulate a faltering economy.
They're stuck.
You face rapid deindustrialization. Heavy industry and manufacturing in Europe are already preparing contingency plans to ration electricity. They are prioritizing basic residential heating over factory output.
And the Iranian leadership has made it very clear that they consider this just the opening salvo, haven't they?
Yes, they have explicitly threatened that if the United States follows through on its paused 48-hour ultimatum, Iran will escalate. They'll go from targeting oil and gas exports to completely destroying the domestic life support systems of the Gulf states.
Meaning what?
They have threatened to wipe out the centralized power grids and water desalination plants of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain.
That highlights a critical underlying tactical asymmetry in the region's infrastructure.
Exactly. Over the decades, anticipating conflict, Iran has engineered its electricity generation into a highly decentralized system.
Hard to hit.
Very. They operate over 150 different power plants, many of them deeply buried or dispersed across the massive, rugged terrain of the Zagros Mountains. It is geographically and mathematically impossible to knock out Iran's power grid in a single surgical air campaign.
But the Gulf monarchies,
In stark contrast, they built modern miracles of glass and steel in the desert, but they rely on highly centralized, incredibly fragile infrastructure nodes.
You're talking about the desalination plants, the
Yeah.
facilities that literally create drinking water from the ocean.
Yes, a handful of massive, highly exposed coastal reverse osmosis desalination plants provide almost all the potable drinking water for millions of people living in essentially arid deserts.
If an Iranian swarm attack bypasses the failed air defenses and destroys the primary desalination plants supplying Saudi Arabia or the UAE, what happens?
You are looking at an unmitigated humanitarian catastrophe within 72 hours. Cities like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, or Riyadh are artificial oases. They cannot exist without that continuous, massive flow of desalinated water.
They literally run out of water.
If the taps run dry, millions of people would have to immediately evacuate. The royal families of the Gulf Cooperation Council understand this math perfectly.
Which is why there are widespread reports of immense panic within the palaces of the GCC right now.
Absolutely. For decades, they believed that hosting massive U.S. military bases guaranteed their security.
Right, the American shield.
But they are now realizing that in an era of hypersonic missiles and failed air defenses, hosting a U.S. base doesn't offer a shield. It paints a massive, unavoidable target on their most critical infrastructure.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the grand finale of this geopolitical unraveling. Let's pull back and look at the broader historical context of what these 26 days of war actually represent.
It's a historic pivot.
Geopolitical historians and analysts are already comparing this exact moment to a very specific paradigm-shifting event from the 20th century.
The 1956 Suez Crisis.
Yes.
It is the most accurate historical parallel available to us. In 1956, Britain and France, colluding with Israel, launched an invasion of Egypt to forcibly retake control of the Suez Canal after Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized it.
They thought they could just take it back.
London and Paris believed they could flex their traditional imperial muscle, depose a troublesome leader, and maintain the old colonial world order through sheer military force. But they critically misjudged the new global dynamic.
The U.S. and the Soviets stepped in.
Both the United States under President Eisenhower and the Soviet Union stepped in and applied massive financial and political pressure. They ultimately forced the British and French to humiliatingly withdraw.
The U.S. essentially threatened to dump British bonds and collapse the pound sterling if they didn't retreat.
Right.
It was the moment the world watched the old empires blink.
It permanently ended British and French imperial dominance in the Middle East. It proved definitively that they were no longer the ultimate arbiters of global power.
And today,
a growing consensus of analysts argues that the Strait of Hormuz has become America's Suez Crisis.
that is a chilling comparison.
The United States is attempting to project power, attempting to assert its traditional dominance through naval carrier strike groups and presidential ultimatums. But the physical reality on the ground, the catastrophic failure of the air defense architecture, the inability to forcibly open the strait to commercial shipping, and the forced reliance of the global market on the Chinese yuan, it all demonstrates that the unipolar moment of undisputed American hegemony is over.
We are witnessing the textbook definition of imperial overstretch.
Yes, we are.
And the irony is incredibly thick here. The United States engaged in this conflict to reassert control, to demonstrate that it still holds the reins of the Middle East. Instead, by pushing the military and economic systems to their breaking points, Washington has violently accelerated the birth of the multipolar world it was desperately trying to prevent.
It's a classic geopolitical backfire.
And while the U.S. and Israel are depleting their advanced arsenals, straining their economies, and arguably destroying the global supply chain, who are the quiet beneficiaries standing on the sidelines?
China and Russia.
Exactly.
They're watching the strategic unraveling with immense satisfaction. China, in particular, is executing a masterclass in passive strategic victory.
How so?
Because Iran needs an outlet for its oil and a source of manufactured goods, China is quietly continuing to receive heavily discounted Iranian crude. And crucially, they are paying for that oil entirely in their own sovereign currency, the yuan.
So they're getting cheap energy and boosting their currency.
China is successfully internationalizing the renminbi, establishing a massive non-dollar energy trade bloc, all without firing a single shot, deploying a single soldier, or risking a single naval vessel.
They are simply letting the U.S. exhaust itself while they build the new toll booth.
Exactly.
And how is Russia maneuvering through this?
Well, Russia is benefiting on multiple fronts. Economically, as the global oil market panics and prices threaten to touch $150 a barrel, Russian state revenues surge.
Because they're a massive oil exporter.
Right. While Western economies face inflation and industrial contraction due to energy starvation, the Russian treasury is being flooded with capital.
And geopolitically.
Geopolitically, Russia is aggressively presenting itself as the stable, diplomatic alternative to American militarism. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has been in constant, highly publicized contact with the Gulf states, with Tehran, and notably, even maintaining back-channel ties with Israel.
Playing all sides.
Russia is positioning itself as the adult in the room, the reliable power broker necessary to build a new Eurasian security architecture once the dust settles.
To put it bluntly, we are essentially watching the United States play a desperate, incredibly destructive game of tactical checkers, sacrificing its most valuable economic pieces.
Right.
While China and Russia are sitting comfortably in plush armchairs, watching the board catch fire.
The geopolitical realignment is happening at a breakneck speed that is difficult to process.
What about the European allies?
Traditional European allies, nations that usually fall in line behind Washington's foreign policy without question, are heavily hesitating to join any U.S.-led maritime coalition to forcibly open the strait.
Why?
They see the vulnerability of their own energy supplies and are quietly distancing themselves. And the Gulf states, as we discussed regarding their infrastructure vulnerabilities, are undergoing a massive existential paradigm shift.
If you are the leadership in Saudi Arabia or the UAE, and you realize that the American military cannot physically protect your desalination plants or your oil refineries from an Iranian hypersonic swarm, what is your next move?
You seek a new security guarantor. It is highly probable, perhaps inevitable at this trajectory, that we will see the Gulf states pivot rapidly and decisively toward the BRICS nations.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa?
Yes. The Gulf monarchies will look to Beijing for long-term economic partnership and technological integration, and they will look to Moscow for security coordination and regional stability.
Wow.
If the United States is ultimately forced to withdraw its military presence from the Middle East, which, as we noted earlier, is Iran's absolute stated condition for peace, the map of global alliances is entirely redrawn overnight.
It is dizzying. I mean, we're merely 26 days into a conflict, and the tectonic plates of the global order have completely shifted beneath our feet. Let's bring all these complex threads together to see the full tapestry of what has happened.
It's a lot to take in.
We started by looking at a domestic political smokescreen. A paused 48-hour ultimatum that the administration claims is for peace talks, but which military logistics suggest is masking the desperate, massive deployment of 4 U.S. military divisions.
A deployment necessitated by the underlying military reality that the vaunted multi-billion-dollar air defense shields of the West have been mathematically overwhelmed and depleted by swarms of cheap drones and entirely bypassed by the advanced physics of maneuverable hypersonic glide vehicles.
Which stripped the U.S. and Israel of their protective umbrella, handing the offensive leverage directly to Iran, allowing Tehran to weaponize the geography of the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
And they did so not just physically, by blocking the shipping lanes with the threat of missiles, but economically by instituting a toll that demands payment in Chinese yuan.
A brilliant asymmetric strategic maneuver that directly bypasses the SWIFT banking system, neutralizes the U.S. Treasury's sanctions regime, and strikes a potentially fatal blow to the petrodollar architecture that has artificially propped up the U.S. economy and funded its massive deficits since the Nixon administration.
While simultaneously the physical destruction of energy infrastructure, specifically the staggering loss of Qatari LNG production, is setting the stage for an immediate brutal wave of global inflation.
Massive spikes in fertilizer and food costs.
And a deep recession that will bypass the abstract world of high finance and directly hit the wallet of every single person listening to this.
It is the rapid, real-time unwinding of American global hegemony. It perfectly echoes the collapse of the British Empire's influence during the 1956 Suez Crisis, leaving a vacuum that China and Russia are more than ready to fill as they inherit the multipolar future.
To everyone listening right now, whether you're driving to work, sitting at your kitchen table, or walking through your neighborhood, the facts and mechanisms we've unpacked today aren't just abstract geopolitical theory meant for think tanks in Washington.
No, this is real life.
The systemic shifts happening right now, this very morning, in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz are actively rewriting the value of your savings account. They are dictating the cost of your commute. They are determining the price of the food on your table. And they are shaping the absolute geopolitical reality that your children are going to inherit.
The world you woke up in 26 days ago, the world of assumed American economic and military supremacy, simply no longer exists. The unipolar era is over.
Which leaves us with a deep, lingering question to consider as you go about your day. If the petrodollar era is truly coming to an abrupt end, how will Western societies, which have been entirely built on decades of artificially cheap debt and cheap energy, underwritten by the sheer, unquestioned dominance of the U.S. dollar, culturally and psychologically adapt to a world where they no longer set the rules or the prices? When the artificial floor drops out and the financial gravity of the rest of the world finally takes hold, who are we without the dollar? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking beneath the smoke screens, and we will see you next time.